Welcome to Stories of the Enslaved. Today, we travel back to 1860, to the story of a young black girl named Abigail Foster, who could sew extraordinary clothing, turning mere scraps into pieces so impossibly beautiful they defied belief. Yet behind every perfect stitch lay a life marked by control, pain, and a terrible truth few were willing to see. This story is intense and difficult. So, take a moment. Breathe. Listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In the spring of 1860, the wealthiest women of Charleston, South Carolina, gathered at the most exclusive dress shop on King Street. They whispered about a mysterious French seamstress whose creations were unlike anything they had ever seen. The stitching was impossibly perfect. The designs took their breath away. The fabric seemed to flow like water. These dresses cost more than most working men earned in an entire year. Yet the waiting list stretched for months. Plantation wives, merchant daughters, and society matrons all competed for the privilege of wearing these magnificent gowns. But none of them knew the truth. Not one of them could have imagined that behind every silk ribbon, behind every delicate pearl button, behind every stitch placed with such precision, was a 12-year-old black girl named Abigail. A child who had never once worn shoes. A child who had never tasted freedom. A child whose extraordinary talent was being stolen, exploited, and hidden from the world. This is her story, and it will change the way you see everything. Charleston in 1860 was a city of contradictions. It stood as one of the wealthiest cities in America, built upon the backs of enslaved people, who outnumbered white residents by a significant margin. The harbor bustled constantly with ships carrying cotton, rice, and human beings. Grand mansions lined the streets south of Broad, their elegant facades hiding the brutal reality of the people who made that wealth possible. The city held roughly 40,000 residents, and more than half of them were enslaved. This was a place where human beings were bought and sold at auction houses located just blocks away from fancy restaurants and theaters. It was a city where a black person could be whipped for looking a white person in the eye. It was a city where families were torn apart every single day. And it was in this city, on a sprawling estate just outside the main commercial district, that Abigail Foster lived and suffered. The Foster family had been in South Carolina for 3 generations. They were not among the wealthiest plantation owners, but they considered themselves respectable. Richard Foster owned a modest cotton operation about 20 miles outside the city, along with a townhouse in Charleston where his wife, Margaret, preferred to spend most of her time. Richard was a stern man in his 50s who believed discipline was the foundation of everything. He had inherited 12 enslaved people from his father and had acquired another 15 through purchase and birth over the years. To him, these human beings were property, nothing more. They were tools to be used, maintained, and replaced when necessary. His wife, Margaret, was a different kind of cruel. She was obsessed with appearances, with status, with being seen as a lady of refinement and taste. She spent money they did not really have on dresses, jewelry, and parties. She wanted desperately to climb the social ladder of Charleston society, but the truly wealthy families looked down on her. She was not quite rich enough, not quite connected enough, not quite elegant enough. This frustration made her bitter, and she took that bitterness out on the people who could not fight back. Abigail was born in 1848 on the Foster plantation. Her mother, a woman named Ruth, worked in the main house as a cook and cleaner. Abigail never knew her father. He had been sold to another plantation owner when Ruth was still pregnant, and no one ever spoke of him again. This was common. Enslaved families were separated constantly, without warning, without mercy. Children grew up not knowing their parents. Parents lived their entire lives wondering what happened to their children. It was one of the countless cruelties of the system, designed to break the human spirit and prevent any sense of family or community that might lead to resistance. Ruth did everything she could to protect her daughter. She taught Abigail to be quiet, to be invisible, to never draw attention to herself. She taught her to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and to always keep her eyes on the ground. She taught her that survival meant submission, at least on the surface. But Ruth also taught her daughter something else, something secret, something precious. She taught her how to sew. Ruth had learned to sew from her own mother, who had been brought to America on a slave ship from the west coast of Africa in 1795. That grandmother had been a skilled craftswoman in her homeland, creating elaborate textiles for ceremonies and celebrations. She carried that knowledge across the ocean, through the horror of the Middle Passage, and into the fields of South Carolina. She passed it down to her daughter, and her daughter passed it down to Ruth, and Ruth passed it down to Abigail. It was a chain of skill and artistry that stretched back across generations and continents. When Abigail was just 5 years old, Ruth began teaching her the basics: how to thread a needle, how to make a straight stitch, how to cut fabric without wasting a single inch. They practiced at night in the small cabin they shared with 4 other enslaved people, using scraps of cloth that Ruth collected from the main house. Margaret Foster threw away fabric constantly, disgusted by the smallest stain or imperfection. Ruth retrieved these scraps and used them to teach her daughter. It was dangerous. If they were caught, they would be punished. Enslaved people were not supposed to have skills beyond what their owners assigned them. But Ruth believed that knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken away. As it turned out, she was wrong about that. She could not have known. By the time Abigail was 8 years old, her skill with a needle was remarkable. Her stitches were tiny and even. Her sense of proportion was instinctive. She could look at a piece of fabric and see what it wanted to become. Ruth was amazed and terrified in equal measure. She knew this talent could either save her daughter or destroy her. She prayed it would remain hidden. But in a household run by Margaret Foster, nothing stayed hidden for long. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1856. Abigail was 8 years old. Margaret had torn her favorite handkerchief on a rose bush in the garden, and she was furious. The handkerchief had been imported from France, embroidered with delicate flowers, and it had cost more than most people earned in a month. Margaret screamed at Ruth, demanding that she fix it immediately. Ruth tried. She was a competent seamstress, but this kind of fine embroidery was beyond her skill. Her stitches were visible. The repair was obvious. Margaret slapped her across the face and called her worthless. Abigail was in the corner of the kitchen, trying to be invisible as her mother had taught her. But she could not watch her mother be humiliated. She could not watch her mother fail at something Abigail knew she could do. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. She said, "I can fix it." 3 words that would change her life forever. Margaret turned to look at the small girl in the corner. She laughed. A child. Fix French embroidery. Impossible. But Ruth's face had gone pale, and Margaret noticed. There was something here, some secret. She demanded that Abigail show her what she could do. Ruth begged. She actually got on her knees and begged Margaret not to make Abigail demonstrate her sewing. But Margaret was intrigued now, and nothing would stop her. She handed the torn handkerchief to the 8-year-old girl and watched. What happened next made Margaret Foster's eyes go wide. Abigail's small fingers moved with a precision that seemed impossible for a child. She matched the thread perfectly to the original embroidery. She replicated the flower pattern as if she had designed it herself. Within 20 minutes, the handkerchief looked better than new. The repair was invisible. Margaret examined it under a magnifying glass and could not find the stitches. She looked at the child standing before her, barefoot and thin and terrified, and she saw something she had never seen before. She saw an opportunity. The next morning, Abigail was taken from her mother. Ruth screamed and fought and had to be restrained by 2 male enslaved workers. Abigail was carried to the back of the main house, to a room that had been used for storage. It was small, about 10 feet by 12, with one tiny window near the ceiling that let in a sliver of light. There was a table, a chair, and a small cot in the corner. This would be Abigail's new home. This would be her prison. Margaret Foster stood in the doorway and explained the situation in her cold, precise voice. Abigail would sew. She would sew whatever Margaret told her to sew. She would work from dawn until Margaret was satisfied. If she did good work, she would be fed. If she did poor work, she would be punished. If she tried to escape or tell anyone about her situation, her mother would be sold to the worst plantation in the state. Abigail was 8 years old. She understood perfectly. She understood that she had just become a different kind of slave. Not a field worker, not a house servant, but something else entirely. A machine. A tool. A secret weapon in Margaret Foster's desperate climb toward social acceptance. The first year was the hardest. Abigail worked 16 hours a day, sometimes more. Her fingers bled until calluses formed. Her eyes ached from straining in the dim light. Her back cramped from hunching over the table. Margaret brought her projects constantly, demanding perfection: a dress that needed alterations, a tablecloth that needed embroidery, a set of napkins for a dinner party. Abigail completed each task with mechanical precision, because the alternative was unthinkable. She saw her mother once a week on Sunday mornings, for exactly 1 hour. These visits were supervised. They were not allowed to speak about Abigail's work. They were not allowed to embrace for more than a few seconds. Ruth would hold her daughter's hands and examine them for cuts and bruises. She would whisper, "I love you," and "Stay strong," and "God is watching." Abigail wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that someone was watching, that someone cared, that this suffering had some purpose. But as the months passed, her faith began to fade. God seemed very far away from that small room with its sliver of light. By 1858, when Abigail was 10 years old, Margaret Foster had developed a plan. The dresses that Abigail created were extraordinary. They were better than anything available in Charleston. They were better than anything Margaret had seen in fashion magazines from Paris. If Margaret wore these dresses herself, she would certainly attract attention. But attention was not enough. She wanted money. She wanted power. She wanted to be someone who mattered. So, she approached a dress shop owner named Eliza Peton, a widowed woman who ran a small but respectable establishment on King Street. Margaret showed her one of Abigail's creations, a blue silk evening gown with hand-embroidered roses climbing up the bodice. Eliza Peton nearly fainted. She had never seen anything like it. She asked where it came from, who made it, how she could get more. Margaret smiled and lied smoothly. She said she had connections with a seamstress in Paris, a woman who had trained at the finest fashion houses but preferred to work in obscurity. This seamstress would create exclusive designs for Eliza's shop, for a substantial fee. Of course, the arrangement would be secret. No one could know where the dresses came from. It would add to the mystique, to the exclusivity, to the desirability. Eliza Peton agreed immediately. She would have agreed to almost anything to sell gowns like that blue silk masterpiece. The first dress sold within 2 days. The buyer was the wife of a cotton factor, a man who arranged sales between plantation owners and textile mills. She paid $300, an astronomical sum in 1858. She wore the dress to a ball at the St. Cecilia Society, the most exclusive social organization in Charleston. Within a week, every woman at that ball wanted to know where the dress came from. Eliza Peton pretended to be reluctant, pretended the dresses were almost impossible to obtain, pretended that only the most discerning clients could even be considered for the waiting list. It was brilliant marketing. Demand exploded. Margaret Foster could barely contain her excitement. She returned to the small room where Abigail worked and informed her that production would need to increase. Abigail would now be creating 3 gowns per month instead of 1. The hours would be longer. The standards would be higher. There would be no margin for error. Abigail did not protest. She had learned that protest was pointless. She simply nodded and continued working. But something inside her was changing. She was no longer just a frightened child trying to survive. She was becoming something else. She was becoming an artist. Even in her misery, even in her exhaustion, even in her captivity, she found moments of something like joy. When she worked, when she saw a piece of fabric and imagined what it could become, when she solved a difficult technical problem with an elegant solution, when she finished a garment and knew with absolute certainty that it was beautiful. These moments were small, they were fleeting, but they were hers. Margaret Foster could steal her labor. Margaret Foster could steal her childhood. Margaret Foster could steal her freedom. But she could not steal the feeling that rose in Abigail's chest when she created something perfect, a feeling that belonged to Abigail alone. The year 1859 brought changes to the Foster household. Richard Foster's cotton crop had failed due to heavy rains and an early frost. The family was in financial trouble. They owed money to banks, to suppliers, to other plantation owners. Richard wanted to sell some of their enslaved workers to cover the debts. He specifically mentioned Ruth. She was getting older, he said, her value was declining. Better to sell now and get something for her. Margaret refused. Not because she cared about Ruth, not because she worried about Abigail's emotional state. She refused because she understood that Ruth was leverage. As long as Margaret controlled Ruth, she controlled Abigail. And Abigail's hands were now the most valuable asset the Foster family possessed. The dress business with Eliza Petton had grown enormously. They were now selling 10 to 15 gowns per month, each one priced between $200 and $500, depending on complexity. The profit was divided between Margaret and Eliza, with Margaret receiving the larger share. It was more money than the plantation had ever generated. It was keeping the family afloat. Richard Foster grumbled but agreed to keep Ruth for now. He did not know where the money was really coming from. He did not know about Abigail's role. Margaret had kept that secret even from her own husband. She told him she had made some wise investments. He was too preoccupied with his failing crops to ask questions. Abigail turned 11 in 1859. She had been working in the small room for 3 years. She had created over 100 garments in that time, dresses, cloaks, jackets, undergarments, accessories. Each one was a masterpiece. Each one was sold to wealthy white women who would never know her name. She had grown taller but remained thin. Her diet was barely adequate. Margaret provided enough food to keep her working, but not enough to keep her healthy. Abigail suffered from headaches, from stomach pains, from a persistent cough that would not go away. She dreamed sometimes of running away. She had heard whispers about the Underground Railroad, about enslaved people who escaped to the north and found freedom. But she knew that running away meant abandoning her mother. It meant never seeing Ruth again. It meant condemning Ruth to whatever punishment Margaret would inflict. This was the trap. This was how the system worked. It used love as a chain. It used family as a cage. Abigail loved her mother too much to leave her. And so she stayed. The year turned to 1860. It was January, and Charleston was buzzing with political tension. The election later that year would decide whether the nation would continue to tolerate slavery or attempt to restrict it. Southern politicians were already talking about secession, about breaking away from the United States and forming their own country where slavery would be protected forever. Abigail heard fragments of these conversations through the walls of her small room. She did not fully understand the politics, but she understood the stakes. If the South won, her situation would never change. She would die in this room, working until her fingers could no longer hold a needle. If the North won, maybe, possibly, someday, there might be freedom. It seemed impossibly distant. It seemed like a fairy tale. But she held on to it anyway, because hope was all she had. In February of 1860, something unexpected happened. A new customer appeared at Eliza Petton's dress shop. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and she was different from the other wealthy women of Charleston. Eleanor was from Boston originally, a city in Massachusetts where slavery was not legal and abolitionists openly advocated for the freedom of all enslaved people. She had married a Charleston merchant named Thomas Whitmore 5 years earlier and had struggled to adapt to Southern society. She found the casual cruelty toward black people disturbing. She kept these feelings to herself because expressing them would have made her life impossible. Her husband's business depended on relationships with plantation owners. Her social standing depended on acceptance by other wealthy wives. She had learned to stay quiet, but she had never learned to stop seeing. She noticed things that other white women ignored, the scars on the hands of the enslaved people who served her, the fear in their eyes when they made mistakes, the way they were spoken to like animals, like objects, like nothing at all. She noticed, and she remembered, and she filed everything away in her mind. Eleanor Whitmore walked into Eliza Petton's shop on a cold February morning because she needed a dress for the governor's ball in April. She had heard about the mysterious French seamstress whose creations were the talk of Charleston society. She was curious. When Eliza showed her the sample book, Eleanor was genuinely impressed. The designs were extraordinary. The craftsmanship was flawless. She ordered a gown in deep burgundy silk with gold embroidery, willing to pay whatever price was asked. But she also asked questions. Where exactly in Paris was the seamstress located? What was her training? How had Mrs. Foster discovered her? Eliza provided the standard vague answers. The seamstress valued her privacy. She worked through intermediaries. It was all very exclusive and mysterious. Eleanor smiled and nodded and paid her deposit. But something did not add up. She had lived in Boston near the garment district. She knew how dressmaking worked. She knew that even the most skilled seamstress needed a team of assistants to produce garments at this rate. She knew that transporting delicate gowns across the Atlantic Ocean would risk damage. She knew that the timeline Margaret Foster described was impossibly fast for overseas production. There was something wrong with this story. And Eleanor Whitmore was not the kind of woman who could leave a mystery unsolved. Meanwhile, in her small room, Abigail was working on Eleanor's dress without knowing anything about the woman who would wear it. She only knew that it was a special order, that Margaret had specified burgundy silk and gold thread, that the deadline was 6 weeks away. She had done this dozens of times before. She would create something beautiful, and it would disappear, and she would never know who wore it or what they thought of it. But this dress felt different, somehow. Abigail could not explain why. Maybe it was the quality of the fabric, which was finer than anything she had worked with before. Maybe it was the color, that deep, rich burgundy that reminded her of something she could not quite remember. Maybe it was simply that she was tired, that her mind was wandering, that she was allowing herself to imagine things she normally kept locked away. She imagined the woman who would wear this dress. She imagined her dancing at a beautiful ball. She imagined her feeling confident and elegant and admired. She imagined her being happy. These were dangerous thoughts. These were the kind of thoughts that led to despair. But Abigail could not stop them. As she sewed gold thread into burgundy silk, she allowed herself to wonder if the woman who wore this dress would ever think about who made it. She allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would see her work and recognize that a human being had created it. Not a machine. Not a tool. A person. A person with dreams and fears and a mother she missed terribly. A person who deserved more than this. Spring came to Charleston with its usual explosion of color and warmth. The gardens bloomed. The social season reached its peak. Eleanor Whitmore received her burgundy gown and was stunned by its beauty. She had seen fine dressmaking in Boston, in New York, even in Paris during a trip abroad. But she had never seen anything like this. The stitching was impossibly precise. The embroidery depicted flowers that seemed almost alive. The fit was perfect, even though she had only been measured once, briefly, by Mrs. Petton's assistant. How had the seamstress known exactly how the fabric would drape? How had she anticipated the way Eleanor moved, the way she stood, the way she breathed? It was uncanny. It was unsettling. It was magnificent. Eleanor wore the dress to the governor's ball on April 14, 1860. She received more compliments in one evening than she had in her entire 5 years in Charleston. Women begged to know where the dress came from. Men stared openly. Even the governor's wife, a formidable woman who intimidated everyone, approached Eleanor to ask about the seamstress. Eleanor provided the same vague answers she had received: Paris, exclusive, very mysterious. But she was thinking. She was wondering. She was planning. 2 weeks after the ball, Eleanor Whitmore did something unusual. She visited Margaret Foster at the Foster townhouse in Charleston. They were not close friends, they moved in overlapping but not identical social circles. Margaret was surprised by the visit and flattered by the attention. She served tea and made conversation about the weather, about the upcoming social events, about the election and its implications. Eleanor listened and nodded and asked careful questions. She complimented Margaret on her beautiful home. She asked about the lovely curtains in the drawing room. She wondered if they had been made locally or imported. Margaret, eager to impress, explained that she had them made by her own household staff. She had a girl, she said, who was quite handy with a needle. Eleanor's heart rate increased, but her face remained calm. A girl handy with a needle. She filed this information away and changed the subject smoothly. They talked about other things for another hour. When Eleanor finally left, she thanked Margaret for her hospitality and mentioned that she might need some alterations done on a few older dresses. Nothing fancy, just some adjustments. Would Margaret's girl be available for such simple work? Margaret hesitated. She did not want anyone to see Abigail. She did not want anyone to connect the girl in the back room with the gowns in Eliza Peton's shop. But refusing would seem strange. It would raise questions. And the request was for simple alterations, not new creations. Surely that would be safe. Surely no one would look at basic hemming and think anything of it. Margaret smiled and agreed. She would have her girl do the alterations. Eleanor should send the dresses over whenever convenient. The dresses arrived at the Foster house 3 days later. There were 4 of them, all needing minor adjustments. Margaret brought them to Abigail's room and explained the situation. Simple alterations, nothing complicated. Get them done quickly and do not make any mistakes. Abigail nodded and took the dresses. She examined them carefully, as she always did. 3 of them were ordinary, well-made but unremarkable garments that could have come from any competent seamstress. But the 4th dress made her breath catch in her throat. It was burgundy silk with gold embroidery. She recognized it immediately. She had made this dress. She had spent weeks on it. She remembered every stitch, every decision, every moment of creation. And now here it was, back in her hands, needing a small adjustment to the hem. She touched the fabric gently, as if greeting an old friend. Who was the woman who wore this dress? What was she like? Why had she sent it back? Abigail had so many questions she could never ask. She completed the alterations quickly and perfectly, and the dresses were sent back to Eleanor Whitmore. But something had shifted. For the first time, Abigail felt a connection to the world outside her small room. Someone was wearing her creations. Someone was living a life that Abigail could only imagine. And somehow, impossibly, the universe had arranged for one of those creations to return to her, even if only for a moment. Eleanor examined the alterations on her returned dresses with extreme care. She was looking for something specific. She was looking for evidence. And she found it. The stitching on the alterations was identical to the stitching on the original burgundy gown. Not just similar. Identical. The same tension, the same spacing, the same distinctive way of finishing a seam that was almost a signature. Eleanor had studied textiles during her education in Boston. She knew that every skilled seamstress developed unique habits and techniques over years of practice. These habits were as individual as handwriting. And the handwriting on these dresses was unmistakably the same. The mysterious French seamstress did not exist. The gowns that were making Margaret Foster wealthy and Eliza Peton famous were being created right here in Charleston, by someone in the Foster household, by a girl who was quite handy with a needle. Eleanor Whitmore put down the dress she was examining and stared out the window at the Charleston street below. She had discovered a secret. A profitable secret. A dangerous secret. The question was what to do with it. She could confront Margaret. She could expose the fraud to Eliza Peton. She could tell the other women of Charleston that they had been deceived. But then what? The girl would still be enslaved. The situation would not fundamentally change. Margaret might be embarrassed, might lose her business arrangement, might even face some social consequences. But the girl would still be trapped. Eleanor needed more information. She needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. She needed to see this girl with her own eyes. The summer of 1860 was brutally hot in Charleston. Temperatures rose above 90 degrees day after day. The air was thick and humid. Tempers were short. Political tensions were reaching a breaking point as the November election approached. Abraham Lincoln, a candidate from the new Republican Party, was leading in the polls. Southern politicians were openly discussing what they would do if Lincoln won. They would leave the Union, they said. They would form their own nation. They would protect their way of life at any cost. Their way of life meant slavery. Their way of life meant people like Abigail Foster working in small rooms, creating beautiful things they would never own for people who would never know their names. The future was uncertain. Everything was about to change. But in her small room, Abigail knew nothing of politics or elections or the forces that were shaping her world. She only knew the fabric in her hands and the deadline approaching and the endless, exhausting rhythm of her days. August brought a development that would prove crucial. Eleanor Whitmore arranged to visit the Foster house again, this time with a specific request. She wanted a completely new dress designed and created for a Christmas celebration her husband was planning. She wanted it to be spectacular. She wanted to discuss the design personally with Margaret Foster and, if possible, with the talented girl who did the household sewing. It was an unusual request. Margaret tried to decline. She explained that the girl was very busy, that she did not work with customers directly, that it would be better if Margaret simply took the order and conveyed the instructions. But Eleanor was insistent. She was charming and flattering and absolutely immovable. She simply could not imagine commissioning such an important dress without meeting the person who would create it. Surely Margaret understood. Surely she would make an exception for such an important customer. Margaret was trapped. Refusing would seem suspicious. It might damage the business relationship. It might lead to gossip and speculation. She had no choice. She agreed to arrange a meeting. But she warned Eleanor that the girl was simple, that she could barely speak, that she was not accustomed to dealing with ladies of quality. Eleanor smiled and said she understood completely. She would be patient. She would be kind. She would not expect too much. The meeting was scheduled for August 23, 1860. It was a Thursday afternoon. The temperature was 94 degrees. Eleanor Whitmore arrived at the Foster house wearing a light cotton dress and carrying a parasol. She was shown into the drawing room, where Margaret was waiting with tea and small sandwiches. They chatted for a few minutes about inconsequential things. Then Margaret rang a small bell, and a door at the back of the room opened. A house servant led in a thin girl with dark skin and large eyes that darted nervously around the room. She was wearing a simple gray dress that was clean but worn. Her feet were bare. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and Eleanor could see the calluses and small scars that covered them. This was Abigail Foster. This was the mysterious French seamstress. This was the creator of the most magnificent gowns in Charleston. She was 12 years old. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. She had known, intellectually, what she would find. She had suspected the truth for months. But seeing it was different. Seeing this child, this thin and frightened child with damaged hands and eyes that had seen too much, standing in a drawing room being presented like a curiosity at a fair, something inside Eleanor cracked open and could not be put back together. She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab this girl and run out of the house and never stop running. She wanted to burn Charleston to the ground. Instead, she smiled. She kept her voice calm. She thanked Margaret for arranging the meeting. She turned to Abigail and spoke gently, the way you might speak to a wild animal you were trying not to startle. She said hello. She said she had heard wonderful things about her sewing. She said she would like very much to commission a dress if Abigail was willing. Abigail looked at Margaret for permission before responding. Margaret nodded curtly. Abigail whispered that she would be honored to create a dress for the lady. Her voice was soft, barely audible, as if she had forgotten how to speak at normal volume. Eleanor asked about the design. She asked about colors and fabrics and embellishments. She asked questions that required Abigail to think and respond and demonstrate her knowledge. With each answer, Abigail grew slightly more confident. She talked about the weight of silk versus satin, about how certain colors reflected light in ballrooms, about the way embroidery could create illusions of movement. She was intelligent. She was articulate. She was, despite everything, still capable of passion when discussing her craft. Eleanor listened and nodded and asked more questions. Margaret watched nervously, ready to intervene if Abigail said anything inappropriate. But Abigail was careful. She had learned to be careful. She answered Eleanor's questions about dressmaking without revealing anything about her situation. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. At the end, Eleanor thanked both Margaret and Abigail and promised to send detailed instructions for the Christmas dress within the week. She left the Foster house with a pleasant smile on her face and murder in her heart. She walked home through the hot Charleston streets, her parasol protecting her from the sun. And she thought about what she had seen. She thought about what she had to do. She thought about the risks and the consequences and the moral weight of every possible choice. By the time she reached her own front door, she had made a decision. She was going to help that girl. She did not know how yet. She did not know what help would look like or whether it would even be possible. But she was going to try. She had looked into those eyes, those large, dark eyes that held so much pain and so much hidden fire, and she had seen a human being. A human being who deserved better. A human being who deserved freedom. Eleanor Whitmore was not a brave woman by nature. She had spent 5 years in Charleston learning to keep quiet and fit in and not make trouble. But sometimes, she was beginning to understand, not making trouble was the worst trouble of all. September passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor corresponded with Margaret about the Christmas dress, using the communication as an excuse to request occasional meetings with Abigail to discuss details. Each meeting was brief and supervised, but Eleanor learned more each time. She learned that Abigail's mother was still on the plantation outside the city. She learned that Abigail had been sewing in that small room for over 4 years. She learned that she worked every day from before sunrise until late at night. She learned these things not from direct questions, which would have been dangerous, but from careful observation and inference. She also began to form a plan. It was risky. It was potentially illegal. It could destroy her husband's business, her social standing, her entire life. But she had looked into those eyes. She had seen that child with the damaged hands. She could not unsee it. She would not unsee it. The only question was whether she had the courage to act. October brought the election. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. Charleston exploded in fury. There were protests in the streets, speeches about honor and independence, declarations that the South would never accept a president who opposed slavery. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Other Southern states would follow in the coming weeks and months. The nation was tearing itself apart, and Charleston was at the center of the storm. In her small room, Abigail heard fragments of shouting and celebration from the streets outside. She did not understand what secession meant, but she understood that it was important. She understood that something was changing. Whether that change would help her or hurt her, she could not guess. She could only continue doing what she had always done. She could only survive. 3 days before Christmas, Eleanor Whitmore's dress was delivered to her home. It was the most beautiful thing Abigail had ever created, deep green velvet with silver embroidery depicting snowflakes and winter branches, a fitted bodice that flattered without restricting, a full skirt that would catch the light from 1,000 candles. Eleanor put it on and stood in front of her mirror, and for a moment she forgot everything else. The dress was extraordinary. It was a work of art. It had been created by the hands of a child who would never wear anything like it, who would never attend a party, who would never dance or laugh or feel beautiful. Eleanor took off the dress carefully and hung it in her closet. She sat down at her writing desk. She took out a piece of paper, and she began to write a letter. The letter was addressed to her sister in Boston. It contained coded language that they had developed years ago, when Eleanor first moved south. It asked for help. It asked for contacts. It asked about routes and timing and safe houses. It was the first step in a plan that would either save Abigail Foster or destroy Eleanor Whitmore. Possibly both. Christmas of 1860 was subdued in the Foster household. The political situation had everyone on edge. Richard was worried about the plantation, about the economy, about the possibility of war. Margaret was worried about maintaining her dress business if supplies became scarce. Abigail spent Christmas Day alone in her small room, working on a New Year's gown for one of Eliza Petton's customers. She was allowed 1 hour to visit her mother in the evening, a concession that Margaret granted more from practicality than kindness. Ruth had been sick for several weeks, a cough that would not go away, and Margaret needed Ruth well enough to work. The visit was heartbreaking. Ruth had grown thin and gray. She could barely stand. But she held Abigail's hands and looked into her daughter's face and told her that she loved her, that she was proud of her, that she believed better days were coming. Abigail wanted to believe her. She wanted so desperately to believe that this suffering had a purpose, that freedom was possible, that she would not spend her entire life in that small room with its sliver of light. But she had been hoping for so long. Hope was exhausting. Sometimes she wondered if it would be easier to stop hoping altogether. Just accept that this was her life. Just accept that nothing would ever change. Just sew and sleep and sew again until she died. That would be easier. But her mother's eyes were on her face. Her mother's hands were holding hers. And she could not give up while her mother still had faith. She would keep hoping. She would keep surviving. She would keep creating beautiful things in her ugly prison and wait for something to change. January of 1861 brought bitter cold and bitter news. More states seceded from the Union. The Confederate States of America began to form. War seemed increasingly inevitable. And Ruth Foster's cough grew worse. By the middle of the month, she could no longer work. Margaret was furious at the inconvenience. Richard wanted to send Ruth to the plantation infirmary, which was little more than a place where sick enslaved people went to die. Abigail begged. She actually got on her knees and begged Margaret to let her mother stay in Charleston, to get medicine, to see a doctor. It was the first time she had ever asked for anything. It was the first time she had ever shown emotion in front of her captors. Margaret looked at the girl kneeling before her, this 12-year-old whose hands had earned the Foster family more money than the cotton plantation, and she made a calculation. Abigail was more productive when she was not distracted by worry. A doctor's visit for Ruth would be a small expense compared to the loss of output if Abigail became too distracted to work properly. Margaret agreed to send for a doctor. It was not kindness. It was business. But Abigail did not care about Margaret's motives. She only cared that her mother would receive help. The doctor came on January 19th. He examined Ruth and shook his head gravely. Consumption, he said, the disease that we now call tuberculosis. It was advanced. There was little that could be done except make her comfortable. With proper rest and nutrition, she might live 6 months, perhaps a year, perhaps less. The doctor spoke to Margaret as if Ruth were not in the room, as if she were a piece of furniture being discussed for repair. He prescribed some medicines that would ease the coughing. He suggested keeping her isolated to prevent spread of the disease. He collected his fee and left without ever once addressing Ruth directly, without ever once acknowledging her as a human being. That night, Abigail sat alone in her small room and cried for the first time in years. Her mother was dying. The one person in the world who loved her, the one person who remembered that she had once been a happy child, the one person who kept her connected to anything resembling hope, was going to die. And Abigail could do nothing about it. She could only sew and wait and watch the sliver of light from her window move across the floor as the days passed, counting down toward an ending she could not bear to imagine. And so we leave Abigail Foster in January of 1861, on the brink of war, on the brink of loss, on the brink of either destruction or salvation. She does not know what is coming. She does not know that Eleanor Whitmore has been corresponding with abolitionists in Boston. She does not know that plans are being made, risks are being calculated, routes are being mapped. She knows only the fabric in her hands, the ache in her back, the cough from the room where her mother is slowly fading. She is 12 years old. She has created hundreds of beautiful garments that she will never wear. She has made thousands of dollars for people who consider her property. She has never been paid, never been thanked, never been acknowledged as anything other than a tool. And yet, somehow, she has not been destroyed. Somehow she has retained the ability to create beauty in the midst of ugliness, to find meaning in meaningless labor, to love her mother and hope for freedom and believe that someday, somehow, her life might be different. This is the power of the human spirit. This is what slaveholders could never fully extinguish, no matter how hard they tried. This is what Abigail Foster carried inside her, burning like a small flame in the darkness, waiting for air, waiting for fuel, waiting for the moment when it could finally blaze into light.